Dr. Beachy got his PhD at Michigan State University, did postdoctoral work at Arizona and Cornell, and has held academic positions at Washington University in St. Louis and at the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California. At Scripps, he was co-founder of the International Laboratory for Tropical Agricultural Biotechnology. He has published more than, and it exhausts me to say this, 200 peer-reviewed publications, 50 invited book chapters. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and has received a number of scientific awards. No, I'm not going to name them, don't worry, including the Wolf International Prize in Agriculture. Dr. Beachy is internationally known for his work in plant virus infection, including the development of transgenic or genetically engineered or genetically modified plants that are resistant to virus infection. His early research is credited with leading to the development of the world's very first genetically modified food crop, a virus-resistant tomato. Dr. Beachy is current and founding president of the nonprofit Danforth Plant Science Center. The mission of the Danforth Center is no less than to improve the human condition. That's a quote. Research there focuses on enhancement of the nutritional content of plants to improve human health and to increase agricultural production to create a sustainable food supply. As director, he oversees about 18 principal investigators in their research groups and a total of approximately 200 staff. The Earth's population continues to grow rapidly in the developing world, putting severe pressure on its ecological systems, particularly its soil, water, and climate. The development of genetically improved crops that are rich in carbohydrates, proteins, and vitamins, while also resistant to pests and climatic stresses, is widely considered to be a major tool for improving the economics and sustainability of agriculture. Breeding and genetic science, now informed by the revolutions in genomics and biotechnology, provide many new options that were not available even a very short time ago. However, whether the science has the power to substantially help in dealing with the scale and pace of environmental degradation and human need, and whether societies will provide the milieu, including the needed investment and legal systems, to permit the innovations to be employed on a scale that matters, is unclear. In tonight's lecture, which is entitled Fulfilling the Promise of Crop Biotechnology for the Poor in Africa, Challenges for Science and Society, Dr. Beachy will explore these issues in the context of Africa and its pressing humanitarian and ecological problems. Welcome to OSU, Dr. Beachy.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a busy day in which I've gotten a chance to reacquaint myself with some of your colleagues and talk to a number of people about science and how it can be useful. This is an interesting forum in which to talk about something that I care a lot about. It's not often that one gets to have a conversation. And I hope that as we go through this evening, you'll think about it. You'll have questions that you can ask at the end of the talk. I'll try not to go too long. I don't want to keep everybody here late. And besides, I'll get hungry. They said if I speak now, I can eat later. So we'll move on with the point. The topic that I'm going to describe to you, or my discussion tonight, will be based on some experiences that I've had over the last 20, 25 years. As Steve mentioned, I've been involved in agriculture biotechnology since its earliest times. So we had some of the first transgenic plants, genetically modified plants, were done in St. Louis. A woman at the university, at Washington University, and Dr. Marydel Chilton, along with other colleagues in Belgium and in Germany, developed the technologies. Monsanto commercialized them. And as you know, Monsanto is also in St. Louis. So I'll speak from a bit of a background. And in the first part of the talk, I'm going to give a little overview of why I think this technology is important. Then I'm going to talk about the challenges in Africa. And they're not insubstantial. And so when we talk about using science and technology that will be important and relevant in developing countries, everything has to be in context. And at the end of my last slide will be a slide I received from a professor in Tokyo last week. I was at a meeting called the Science and Technology for Society Forum, STS Forum, in which the audience, or the participants, talked about the ICT, about nanotech, and about biotech. ICT, of course, is Internet communications technologies, nanotechnology and biotechnology, and what society will do with those technologies, how they will impact what we see as our future. And it was an interesting perspective, and the last slide I'll show comes from the professor there who has, from me, an interesting perspective from an economics perspective. So the take-home messages are always important to give first, so that if you fall asleep, you know what I've said. And that is that the problems of sufficient food production in Africa are significant. The challenges of population are greatest in Africa and South Asia. And it's those countries where food production is most critical. And it's also where ecosystems are most in challenge. Secondly, investments in agriculture in country and by external donors has declined, and dramatically declined. In Nigeria, the investments are in oil, yet there 80% of the population live on the land. There's not an infrastructure that's built to produce food in many African countries. It's simply not been funded by those countries. Agriculture will not be successful in the absence of infrastructure. So infrastructure, including education, transport, communications, and so forth, it won't be successful by itself. That should be obvious to most of us. Because it won't be successful without markets. And unless there is infrastructure to handle production, you can't have a successful agriculture. You can't expect people just to grow enough food for themselves and nothing more when you have 80% of the people on the land. It simply doesn't work. There's got to be an economic pull or an economic driver. Improved seeds, including those developed by biotech, will be part of the solution. Not the only, but part of. And secondly, it won't succeed in the present regulatory climate. It's heavily regulated, and that regulation prevents participation of your colleagues here at OSU, at us at the Danforth Center, and at national laboratories and around the world. It simply won't succeed because of the impact of those regulatory structures. I made this slide up a number of years ago, and I still think it's true. You can't have economy without agriculture, food production, and good distribution. You simply can't. And in many societies where there is a poor economic base, a poor worker base, a poor health base, a poor transportation base, it's often because there's not agriculture to start with. That's why this country has been so successful. It built on its stomach, and its stomach was fed by the hard work of agriculturists in this country over the years. We are now only 1.2 million of us are farmers out of 300 million, but it didn't start that way. And to have most countries where most of the working workforce is in fact on small farms, to expect that they can create an economy absent agriculture, or create good health and nutrition absent agriculture, or create worker productivity or economic growth or stability without agriculture is short-sighted, and it leads to failure at the very top. But it was that lack of foundation which has led to many of the challenges in Africa today. It started with an agrarian society, and that agrarian society tried to leapfrog across into other economies, whether it's flour production or oil production or shoe production, without making good agriculture as a foundation that leads to some of the challenges today. This is a slide from Norman Borlaug. I have several slides from our friend Norman Borlaug, and he reminds us of some obvious facts. And that is that we've got only a certain amount of land, a certain amount of fresh water, and a certain amount of time. And these are pretty remarkable facts. Only 3% of the Earth's surface has topsoil where food can grow. That's pretty daunting when you look ahead. And a couple of facts from a few citations from the National Academy of Science. I won't read them. You can read as well as I can do. We have a lot of challenges. When I was growing up in the Midwest, the amount of the yield of corn per acre was 40 bushels per acre in my grandfather's farm. It's now about 160. Fourfold what in that 40 years. It's projected that corn could produce as much as 800 bushels per acre if you unleashed the genetic potential. Pretty massive. This one, if we don't, I mean, as societies become more wealthy, they want more food. So as China grows and as India grows, the amount of food that they will demand will grow greater than just population growth, because the quality of the food that they would prefer is different than the quality of food they've had until this point. That brings a lot of environmental challenges, of course. Pesticide poisoning is high in those countries where pesticides are used widely. And there are many countries where pesticides are used widely. By the way, they're not our pesticides. They're the pesticides that are off patent for the last 20 or 30 years and that are cheap but aren't safe. In many of the poor countries, that's the pesticide use that one sees. 70% of all the fresh water is used in agriculture. Former Senator Paul Simon, who's now deceased, wrote a book on his guess that the next world war is over water. And I'm sure others of you have read similar things. And of course, the greenhouse gas issue. So if we had not, over the last 40 years, 50 years, applied relevant technologies, we would be, we'd have that much less land available. In St. Louis, in the US, it means fewer golf courses and fewer walks in the woods. In other countries, it means sparing the rainforest. But in any event, the technologies that have led us this far in the last 50 years have spared land because we continue to improve the technology. When I flew in here and across from Dallas, it is easy to see the encroachment of land use, of residences in the land use. I remember in graduate school, it was in the 70s when we were all taught by Paul Ehrlich to be really afraid because the economy would fall apart, the environment would fall apart because we were all encroaching into wildlife, into wild areas. Yet we see that even with the removal of prime farmlands from our Midwest cities caused by expansion, we're still doing fine in crop production, not to say it shouldn't be regulated. But this is what's happened in Africa in the last 20 years. In contrast to what we've seen investments in new technologies in other areas, there's a scathing report that came out on the World Bank. I don't know how many of you saw a piece in the New York Times, not this week, but the weekend before, that really blasted the bank for not paying attention to fundamental support of agriculture in developing countries. It's declined remarkably in the last 20 years in favor of medical health and distribution of medicines. But I don't know how many of you have followed, but the numbers of women that have been dying in certain countries in Africa of HIV drugs has been greater than have died of HIV because they're taking the drugs on an empty stomach without nutrition. There's a really interesting study done by a woman, an economist in Uganda. And the realization is you can't have an acceptance of medical supplies or expect that medical care will be enhanced in the absence of food and nutrition. It doesn't work that way. So you have to start with food and nutrition first before you walk in and do drug distribution. Yet that's what the World Bank has done over the last 20 years. It cut funding for education infrastructure, cut funding for the CGIAR. This is this international agriculture research organizations that were funded by the CGIAR, by the World Bank rather. System-wide, they cut it out. And they cut the funding for building markets. So at one point, the bank was interested in creating the infrastructure that would lead a farmer in the rural areas to have a market for their crops. That has recently turned around in the last year and a half or 2 years. I'm not sure to what you credit that, but it was certainly, I think, as a consequence of the work of the African Union. So this recent turnaround suggests perhaps a change in philosophies and a realization of the importance of agriculture and organic in-country growth. In other words, having the country grow their own economy, an organic type of growth of economy from inside rather than being forced or stimulated by the outside. And leaders in the African Union have begun also to realize the importance of agriculture to human health and economic growth. When I visited Kenya about 3 years ago, I met a couple of individuals, including ministers, who said, our prime minister now believes that we have to start having the small farmers have enough food to eat. Isn't that remarkable? They simply had left it out of their plan. So the African leaders are also recognizing that they have neglected agriculture for far too long. So what is the evidence of change in support of agriculture? And what are the questions? What does it mean? Well, will the World Bank, after 2 years of changing their mind, will they change it again, or will they sustain that? There's an in-country commitment to training of scientists, to developing seed systems in agriculture, for water management, et cetera, in societies, in certain countries. There's a group in Africa for agriculture research, and they divide Africa into the east and the west and the central and the north. And countries, and there are changes in South Africa, Mozambique, Rwanda, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and others, but not in Zimbabwe, not in Angola, not in Madagascar. So it's not widespread, but there are changes going on in Africa. And if some of you know of people such as Calestis Juma and others have worked very hard to get the awareness of Africans that this challenge is theirs. It's not going to happen from the outside, but they have got to mobilize from the inside. And that's been a very interesting change. There's also a stated commitment by the Gates Foundation to create a green revolution for Africa. And if some of you have followed the green revolution that happened in Asia, you know that what it takes to make that successful is not going to be the same strategy that will make Africa create a green revolution in Africa. It just won't work the same way. So how they decide to move beyond their into their very capable funding strategies is a question to many of us. How will they do it? Who will establish the agenda? Who will participate? What are the deliverables that this green revolution will have? We don't know yet. The Gates Foundation has announced their intentions, but it's still a little bit early for them to have decided and declared how they're going to go about creating the green revolution for Africa. Some of us have seen that Kofi Annan was developed or was appointed as a director of that activity, and one of his first statements was that agriculture biotechnology would not be part of the solution for Africa, which was a surprise to a number of us, and it was consequently withdrawn by the Gates Foundation. I saw the letter that was just distributed several days ago, in which the Gates Foundation said, no, that's not what we mean, but it's what was said, which sets a tone. I was in Uganda about 5 weeks ago, and I'll tell you that a number of the ministers and the scientists were quite distressed that somebody with the renown of Mr. Annan would make such statements, because they reckon that they've been already disenfranchised in education and technology, and to have a whole technology taken away from them was not something that they welcomed. And there are some countries that are developing biosafety guidelines in Africa. Now a little bit of background of why I think this will be important. Again, another slide from Norman Borlaug and his colleagues, which and his take on this is that biotechnology is going to be a key role in the achievement of realizing genetic potential in crops. But this won't be done alone. It'll take private-public relationships or public-private partnerships, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. And in some ways it helps us, in some ways it can not help us. But it's been 20 years since the first field trial of a genetically modified food. That was when I still had brown hair. And it was done in collaboration with Monsanto. At Washington University, we had no fields. It's not a land-grant school. It's a private university. And this could not have been done. It's a confined field trial that was done in 1987. So, but my real hope is that in 20 years will not we will have more participation of the public sector. That's you and us and others that are in the public sector and rather than in the private sector. You know a lot about the safety of the history of safety of agriculture biotechnology. It's been quite remarkable. It's been stated that no other technology has been so widely adopted with so little negative impact in any technology. Certainly it's not true in biomedical biotechnology. We know a number of individuals that are sensitive to certain drugs that come out of biotechnology. We know of certain challenges that have plagued the industry that works in ICT. We know of the challenges in any manufacturing industry, but this one has had a remarkable safety record, period. And some of the upsides are really quite remarkable. The metric tons of pesticides, insecticides that have simply not been used. The impact, of course, on clean water and clean air and healthier farmers is obvious. The energy savings in 2005 alone was equivalent to removing 4 million cars from the road. And energy is saved because the farmers don't have to go back into the field so often. You need less attention to crops and so forth because of the technology. But we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more going on. Monsanto and BASF just announced a partnership that will allow the stacking of 8 different traits into a single maize plant, a maize crop. Yields are higher. We'll be finding new partnerships that will be created between different private sector elements. As this has transpired, there are a lot of people that think that biotech is found only in the U.S. It's certainly not the case. And the numbers of countries participating is very high. The amount of acreage in each country is, of course, quite different. And the Czech Republic, for example, has only 50,000 acres. Spain, 100,000 acres. This was in 2006. But notice that they're spread around the globe. But notice how little there is in Africa. South Africa, with cotton, is a big player. GM corn also in South Africa. And it's created new opportunities for farmers as well as challenges for what to do with the excess. So there are now 22 countries growing GM crops. A lot of them are smallholder farmers. More than 9 million are smallholder farmers. The Chinese and Indian experiences have been remarkable. There's been some fraudulent claims that come out of these kind of experiences. There are a number of bogus varieties that are not really genetically modified, but are said to be insect resistant and so forth, but are not. But those problems are getting worked out, just as we had in the IT industry. We're having a lot of theft of intellectual property and a lot of false things out in the market, but those will resolve themselves, presumably. And it's interesting that while the Millennium Goals are unlikely to be met, remember the Millennium Goals? Have hunger by 2015. It's now widely recognized that there are more hungry now than there were when they started that. So we're not going to make that goal, but perhaps the 2020 goal is achievable. And the reports from Borlaug and others indicate that biotechnology will be part of the solution. And this is only, for us, the tip of the iceberg. And there are a lot of things that are happening in biotech that I won't talk about in the U.S., but it really promises to open a lot of opportunities for farmers to replace and to be a supplier of materials that will replace petroleum products, whether they're plastics or fine oils and so forth. So that's not part of the discussion tonight, but there's a lot to come. And interestingly, most of this is done in the public sector. Around the world, the numbers of public sector and scientists that are doing in biotech is really high, whether it's in universities in the Philippines or in Malaysia or Thailand or India or Pakistan or 6 or 8 countries in Africa. It's done in the public sector. So on the one hand, there's a lot of interest, and hopefully this will find its way out there. But regarding biotech, it's here to stay. It's not going to go away. It has allowed farmers to cut costs. I have a friend of mine I played tennis with in college, and as soon as the first GM crops were available, Jonathan writes and said, Roger, can you get me some GM soy? He said he had a little farm up in Minnesota. He's an instructor at a small college, teaches ornithology and animal behavior. And he said, I'd like to plant genetically modified soybeans. He said, I really like just to plant it and spray it and then go fishing all summer and come back at about the time of the exams and then go harvest, because he found he could participate in agriculture in a way that didn't take his time. And he's been using them ever since. And it does change the face of farming for small farmers as well as for big farmers. And the pipeline is big. It's full, but it's not. The funnel allowing things out is tiny. But the pipeline in is big, but very little is coming out. And I think there are a number of us talk about this overregulation of biotech crops. And the impact of that is that it's a negative impact of regulation. Is by far the heaviest in the public sector. But nevertheless, public-private partnerships are essential. But these are the pieces of ag biotech that tell many of us that it's here to stay. And we hope that it'll eventually go beyond, even in this country, go beyond corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola. The history record is a safety record is high. And there's a piece there that you can't deny. But it comes with a price. And you have to recognize some of these prices, because while they are important here, they're enormously important in developing countries. It costs now to bring a new variety of corn to market than it used to because of regulations. So that's a negative side. The positive side, that the farmer input costs are higher. Water use is not less yet. Agrochemicals is down. Labor costs are down. Energy use is down. So there's some higher costs and some lower costs that are associated with it. Remember, we're not talking about Africa yet. We're talking about those who have adopted in the markets I talked about earlier. Farming profitability is higher. The trades and policies that relate to trade and economics is problematic. That area has been confounded by biotech, and I think one of your speakers later in this series will talk about this issue. And I hope you come, because the impacts of the legal system and the regulatory system, I think hopefully your speaker will describe. And the consumer interest in foods is one that you'd spend a whole hour on here, and we won't. It was back in the news again today of somebody, yet one more study being done, which talks about consumer interest in biotech compared to non-GM foods. And that gains a lot of attention in the U.S. It contains a lot less attention in developing countries. I don't know how many of you saw a news report several weeks ago that described a protest in Bangkok, in which 3 million pounds of papaya, genetically modified papaya, were dumped in front of the Department of Agriculture office in downtown Bangkok, because they were genetically modified. It was Greenpeace and so forth. They were rapidly the pile of 3 million pounds was gone by cab drivers, by senators, anybody who was around, because they were hungry. The issue wasn't one that had to do with whether or not they were concerned of their health and safety. They had heard all the stuff in the newspapers. They had seen all the reports. At the end of the day, they wanted papaya, and that's largely the question that is important in developing economies. That's not important here. And when you have that kind of a response, the question is, what's the importance of regulatory, and what role should regulatory sciences or the regulatory legislation play in this whole question of ag biotechnology? Now to the topic. What is the suitability of biotechnology now for Africa compared to how we consider it here? So when would you use biotech? Certainly it's not the way you start. And you would apply biotechnology when standard breeding methods have not yielded the kind of results you want. That is sustainability of yield, disease resistance, or areas that you cannot achieve by standard breeding. You don't walk in and say, boy, have I got a solution for you. You go in listening and say, what is the need, and what have you tried? Have you gotten rid of the weeds? Do you want to spray for insects? Do you want to control things with chemicals, or do you want to do it by genetics? And we hear over and over, we've tried organic for 400 years and it hasn't worked. We need something else. But from our vantage point, you want them to skip the chemical revolution of agriculture that we used in this country. You want to use it a different way. So you use when standard breeding methods don't work, and getting drought tolerance and yield protection and sustainability and so forth, you go to the next level. So it's also suitable when the proper knowledge for handling and managing the new materials are available and selected by those in country as the best choice. In other words, it's not your decision to make, it's theirs. And once you engage that decision process, you then allow them to help to drive what the problems are, identify the problems and the solutions. And this is one that's a big thing to me. I got into biotech 25 years ago when the first cloning of plant DNA was done. Actually, before that, nearly 30 years now. Been involved in it from some of the earliest days. And my reason for getting in was because of the training that I had as a graduate student at Michigan State University in the Department of Plant Pathology. And I'm a virologist. And my job was to identify ways to control plant virus diseases. So when we developed a strategy that could be used to protect plants against virus infections by genetic engineering, I was pleased. Boy, was I happy. And so imagine my surprise when those who were against the genetic technology said, wait a minute, that DNA could be a pesticide. Pretty remarkable. So it set me back on my heels and realized that the challenges that are out there are far greater than I had imagined as a naive scientist. But nevertheless, that was what drove it. We wanted to get rid of pests, and we wanted to get rid of the pests and the pathogens, but without chemicals. That's what drove me into it. And a lot of my colleagues in the early years got in for exactly that reason: get rid of the chemicals in agriculture. So it's suitable also when the distribution of new varieties can be received for low cost or free, and yield measurable outcomes and be needs driven. So it's suitable under certain conditions. It's not suitable if it's from an outside push. It's really when it's pulled by those who are in the country in which one wishes to work. So there's a lot that can be done with the science, and a lot of it will be impactful in agriculture in Africa. Resistance to pests and pathogens, crops that require less water, fertilizer, pesticides, and have a higher intrinsic yield potential, higher nutrient content. Now, in this country, we'll take a bolus, a vitamin pill, instead of eat a wide range of vegetables. That's not an option in most countries, in many of the poor economies. I'll tell you, when I was in Uganda 5 weeks ago, I asked my cab driver, how much money do you make? And here's a cab driver that made $100 a month, and he was about 3 times what most people were. Most were $1 a day or $1.50 a day. So what is your food allowance? And he said, you know, Roger, Mister, he didn't know my name. You know, Mister, we buy bananas, plantain, and a bunch of plantain, about the kind you see with, it's a full one that women are walking down the road with on their head. He said that costs $5. That's 2 days worth of wages, and it makes 3 days worth of food. So what do you do with your other $1 a day, right? So it's not an insignificant challenge. This is out in the countryside in Uganda, and he was making $100 a month instead of 35 or 40, which is most of what those in his village eat. And he has no way. He can't buy a tomato, he can't buy lettuce, he can't buy carrots because they cost more. So he's deficient in most of these things because what he buys is low in these vitamins. The other part that I think we won't talk about today, but there's a real exciting part here for science and technology to help out. So what are the kind of projects that are being used now or developed towards Africa and Asia? And some of you know about these. There's the Golden Rice Project, which is at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. It started nearly 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It's now in trials or field trials and feeding trials as well. And that looks quite good and likely to be released by 2011. There's a lot of work to, there's some support of projects in banana, cassava, sorghum, and in addition to rice. These are now all supported by the Gates Foundation, and they're increasing nutrition quality in these areas. There's a project done by a public research organization in Australia for Africa in weevil-resistant cowpeas, so the cowpeas aren't destroyed by beetles during storage. Virus-resistant maize by scientists at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Virus-resistant cassava, sweet potato, peanuts, rice, papaya, multiple institutions, including at our institute. Disease-resistant banana, the University of Louvain in Belgium. This is now being field trialed in Uganda. And of course, Monsanto and other companies are working in Bt cotton and Bt maize in South Africa and now in West Africa as well. So there's a lot of work going on. In fact, there are a lot of public sector scientists in the US and in Europe that are participating in projects for Africa. It's pretty interesting that the European scientists who can't do biotech for their own country are looking for biotech partners in Africa and Asia because they don't have a way that they see forward in their own countries, but are working hard to be relevant in countries in Africa and Asia. At the Danforth Center, we have a number of, I want to tell you how impactful some of the work can be. In less than a year and a half, using support from the Gates Foundation, the Monsanto Foundation, with partnership in Kenya and Uganda, and all freedom to operate issues. That means all licensing done in advance, so that if we're successful, we can deliver the product to those in Africa, were achieved for this project. These are single gene transfers. We increase the amount of beta carotene by 15-fold, the amount of vitamin E by 10-fold, the amount of zinc by 2-fold. This is wrong. This is 2.5-fold increase in protein. The goal is 4-fold. That's not percentage. It should be fold. A cassava has a very low amount of protein. We've increased virus disease resistance to increase yield by as much as 80%. Nutrition studies are scheduled in 2002. We have a medical doctor, a nutritionist at WashU Medical School working with us on the laboratory studies and animal studies. And then field trials in Kenya and Uganda scheduled in 2008. And this would not have happened without public-private partnerships because much of the FTO, many of the patents, much of the intellectual property associated with these traits are found in private companies. Some of them are with us. This guy is, that guy is, that guy is. And this one came out of Italy. So, and this one is. But most of the genetic engineering tools, how do you do genetic engineering in general, is held by private sector. Gotten all the freedom to operate issues taken care of. I might say that for that project, there were 42 different licensing issues that had to be addressed before we could do the experiments. The donors don't want you to do the experiments if you don't have all the licenses taken care of first. So we did that in advance and now making good progress. Our partnerships in Uganda are really remarkable. They have developed field trial sites, new screen houses. We've helped them with some of these things. We've committed quite a bit of resources to Uganda through our granting agencies. So what will limit adoption in Africa? And these are the ones that I think are the big deal. The access to intellectual property. There are many countries in Africa that don't even want to talk about biotech because they hear the word IP, or intellectual property. And just the thought that there might be intellectual property scares them so much that they won't do the experiment because they don't know what it means. They've been told that they could be sued, and that if they use somebody else's technology, that might be something they shouldn't do, notwithstanding that companies don't file patent applications in Africa. But they've been frightened by the whole idea of using intellectual property or inventions in agriculture because they've never had to do this before. They've never tried it before. The cost of research and development is not insignificant. It costs more to do some of the laboratory research than it does to do classical plant breeding. This one is a big deal. They don't know what to do with this. It's been suggested in the US that to bring a new trait to market will cost about $10 million. And that's pretty daunting in this country, let alone in developing countries. So As long as that cost of approval is high, it won't be done because if biosafety is high. Might say that India and China are doing it a different way than the US. And they're being a bit more realistic. And if there's not a pull for the products, it'll lead to slow adoption. What I mean by a pull of products, if you develop a variety of cassava that yields 5 times more than the initial variety of cassava, who cares? Well, there'll be more to sell in the market. Well, that will drive down the price of food. And then you have this cyclical marketing challenges that you have in the U.S., or we used to have in the U.S. until there was a price support that was counter-cyclical. But the cycles affect farmer production and farmer yield. So now the question is, what do you do if you increase the food production by 5-fold, and there's more, and there's a glut, and it just spoils? So in Uganda, there are entrepreneurs that are setting up stations that when there's more cassava than they have now, they'll use it to make fermented products. And those fermented products could be beer, or it could be making a high sugar syrup that would replace corn syrup that they're currently importing from the U.S. And there are those who would like to turn it into biofuels. Cassava is a big starch crop, and anything else they would use to make ethanol. This is what's happened in South Africa. The last couple of years, the yields of corn are so high in some parts of South Africa because of the use of insect-resistant corn varieties. The prices are low, and they have now built at least 2 corn-to-ethanol plants in South Africa. They used to sell it to Zimbabwe. If you've been following Zimbabwe, you know that the inflation rate in Zimbabwe is someplace north of 2,000% a year, so they can no longer afford to buy South African corn that's now in excess, creating a new market challenge, and the market challenge has turned into other uses for the product. So you then create a market pull, which then helps to sustain agriculture over a long period of time. And that will likely develop as other things happen. But the scientific divide that is between the rich and the poor, the scientific illiteracy that happen, or lack of scientific preparedness in these countries is really a challenge. Peter Raven pointed out in a speech given a couple months back that it's no accident that biotech has been accepted in those countries where there's a better science infrastructure. South Africa, for example, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, China, India, Portugal. So that scientific divide amplifies the challenge. And it's our responsibility in training individuals. It's our responsibility as a nation. It's our responsibility as a World Bank to minimize that divide. We talked about it a lot at this meeting in Kyoto, the STS forum, because it's enormous. It's not just in biotech, it's in all sectors of advanced technology. So that the limited in-country investment in agriculture has a magnifying effect as the technology changes. It's pretty easy when it's just tissue culture propagation to make more banana trees, but to make banana varieties that don't have any viruses or any bacteria, it takes a different kind of tissue culture. And that advanced technology alone, which is not biotech except tissue culture biotech, it means that the products of the banana propagation are contaminated by pathogens. And that magnifying, and that's just the simplest of technologies. Weak scientific training not only impacts the ability to do the science, but it leads to suspicion and susceptibility to misinformation. It's been rumored, and I don't know if it's true or false, that the reason the president of Zambia declined American food aid 4 or 5 years ago, which was a combination of GM corn and GM soy, was because his wife's brother had heard a rumor that GM cotton was meant to sterilize Africans. So anything that's GM must be bad. And it was the brother of the wife of the president. He had other advisors. At the end of the day, he made his recommendation based upon a family relationship rather than any knowledge of science or anything that his science advisors would provide. And that's not a good way to make decisions. Trading policies magnify suspicion. And the question that many of us have is, will the changes made in China and India, which has less of a scientific divide, certainly than those in Africa and Asia, The question is, will this influence Africa and other Asian countries? And I think that's a major issue that we don't know the answer to. So what are the recommendations that we see with regard to enhance the adoption of ag biotech as a tool? Not an ag biotech product, but a tool to help the plant breeders. And they're sort of listed here, and I think you can add to this list yourself. But it really relies on making meaningful partnerships that provide training and technical training and intellectual property training. Work together as partners to identify resources for joint research and development with bringing the NGOs, the government and private sector and so forth. And then establish partnerships to establish biosafety protocols, and those that are built on science and based upon relative risk rather than the way this sort of way that it's been being done in Europe at the current time. And use a realistic risk-benefit analysis. We don't know what that means in this country, so I don't know how we expect that to be happening very much in Africa. But those are the challenges, how to bring that as an impact to biosafety. And then to develop strong scientific influence in policymaking. This latter one is one that the U.S. National Academy of Sciences has taken on as a real challenge. How do you get more scientific input into policymaking, whether it's for roads or healthcare or infrastructure in cities with regard to it? How do you bring science to bear on policymaking? So it's equally as important in agriculture as it is in other areas. Now, the last couple of slides are just pretty obvious ones as well. Just a reminder that I think that the science applications will really require a different kind of partnership than we've ever had before. And that's many of these enabling technologies, that means the underlying technology necessary to do plant genetic engineering is held in the private sector. That's because it might have been discovered in the public sector, licensed exclusively to the private sector. We're partly to blame. So how we do that technology management from here out should be different. We have a policy at our place, for example, that we will license our inventions to private companies, but we retain all rights for humanitarian purposes. As a policy, the board bought into this in my first year. I said, we want to make sure that what we invent is available for humanitarian purposes. And it works. And you get companies that agree to it. Just ask for it. So policies that start with academics is equally is important here as well as in previous technologies. So sometimes these trait-based technologies, that's higher vitamins or higher minerals, are held in the public domain. It's almost as hard to get a license out of some universities for the research we're doing as it is out of the private sector. Isn't that a shame? This information, to know how the private sector has developed scientific knowledge about regulatory, which are useful in regulatory approval of a product, is something that most of us are simply unaware of. I mean, if you look at a portfolio of the data presented by a private company that goes into the FDA or the USDA, it's this enormous amount of information. It really is. It's staggering. And we don't know how they do it, but we have to find a way through it so that we have some idea of how they manage the regulatory hurdles. And I think part of the solution will be this one, to develop enhanced crops that have low profitability, that are provided by, and this part, the private sector doesn't do this. So those crops that have low profitability for the private sector require the public investment in it, whether it's strawberries that don't need fungicides or don't need nematicides, or carrots that can grow in the presence of nematodes and still know how to not get the hairy roots and the big, wide, the fat and stubby carrots is something that can come out of the public sector. And but how that's done, because the private sector won't have enough financial incentive to do so. And it's much more clear. It's magnified in Africa. But now a little bit of sobering reality. This came out of an article that was in, I believe, the Herald Tribune on the 28th or 29th of September. And it really is a little frightening because if we think biotech is hard, this is not a biotech product, and it's been a reality check. About 10 years ago, Dr. Monty Jones, who worked at one of the CGIAR institutes, developed what's called new rice for Africa. And this new rice was developed through, it's called wide species hybrids. Normally, plants have ability to cross-fertilize between themselves if they're closely related to each other genetically. You can obviate that by putting them in cell culture and forcing them through a genetic recombination. That wouldn't happen naturally, but you can make it happen in cell dishes, cell plates. And he did that by crossing a species of rice called Oryza glaberrima with edible rice from Asia, or sativa, Oryza sativa. And he created enhanced disease resistance and drought tolerance. It's non-hybrid. It was a non-hybrid rice. It's so-called open pollinated. So his job was to develop a variety that would be used in Africa to produce higher yields with less disease. All right, the story was pretty good. He released that to the public sector, along with, and the public sector, including the government, provided modest amount of fertilizers, and it really was a high success. Increased yields by 3 to 6-fold in different settings. In some settings it was less, in some settings it was as high as 6x. And it increased farmer profit. So it looked pretty good on the way out. Then the farmers, as they should, saved the seeds. But those seeds, those varieties, outcrossed with other varieties that were low yielding, and with time, it totally degraded the value of the new seeds. Because the government did not continue to invest in providing additional seeds to the farmers. And without knowing about it, they simply allowed the germplasm to degrade and had a reduced effectiveness. So they gained profits initially, but they didn't take enough care to be careful how the seeds self-fertilized. They didn't invest in new seeds or new fertilizer, and profits turned lower, and now it's kind of a disappointment. And it was just standard genetic improvement, essentially. So the lessons learned and the relevance to other new technologies, including biotech, should be obvious. You can try all you like, but if there's not infrastructure present, it's not going to succeed. And infrastructure doesn't happen in a one-shot deal. It means commitment over and over, whether it's in training or the government that must continue that investment. And a commitment. Biotech takes a long time. If you're not committed over a long period of time, you won't succeed. This is our view of how long it takes to develop a transgenic crop. Research in the lab, research in the greenhouse, field trials, so forth. That's a long pipeline. And if you don't have the willingness to stay with it, it's like any other plant breeding. It just takes time. It's just a different kind of plant breeding, but it takes a long time to get there. Once you get to this point, of course, then it can move more quickly. Again, remember I said that you should use biotech when there aren't any other solutions that are out there. Not because of just that it's a good way to proceed. So those are the take-home messages that I started with earlier. Now let me show you the slide that was given to me at the University of Tokyo. This is a woman who's Yoko Ishikura from this university. You can say it as well as I can read it, and I can't say it. And she started off, and remember that this is a meeting about 3 different advanced technologies. First of all, recognize this as the major challenge. And nobody's talking about how to limit that. But the recognition is that's the big deal. That's the big monkey on our backs that have to be dealt with. And it's going to affect energy use, water and food, climate change, and environmental degradation. So what kind of solutions are there in the regions where there is low science adoption, where science and technology is not available here? And if this is provided by the countries that have, compared to those that have less. And these are not issues these are not just local issues, they're global. If you've read the projections of how much human displacement there will be as climate changes, it's truly staggering. It makes any displacement we've had in the last 100 years pale in comparison. The numbers of people that will move or will need to move as a consequence of global climate changes. So this is a global issue. It's not something that's going to go away because these are local as well as global issues. And in her opinion, and I think most of us would agree, this has to be a partnership between academics, public and private, government, public, and private relationships, and those have to be through knowledge. And we're not going to make this happen just by burying our head in the ground and say, let's go back to the way it was 50 years ago when my father lived in the hills of Kentucky. It's not going to be that way. And if that's the case, it's going to take a lot greater investment, and it's going to take an acknowledgement of social welfare as being part of the solution, and the private sector has to have some way of a growth potential. You can't do this without some kind of growth and profit in here as well. And this will certainly only happen through collaboration internationally and the harmonization of guidelines and learning how to organize all the information. And imagine the economic or the challenges that come in that blue box. And I see all of these as challenges, but as a scientist, you think of them as great opportunities because it gives an opportunity for you or anyone else with a different background, a different interest area to contribute as well. So that's my last slide. And I think it has opportunities for us to talk about science and technology, but it also has some sobering recognition that we simply aren't doing enough now. And this guy is a biggie that I think a big component of decision making that we'll have as we go forward. So I'll turn it back to you and welcome questions if you have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope this isn't a long question.
I'll make it a short answer.
So I was in China a couple of months ago, and driving around Beijing with Guy Yili, who you might know, and just looking at this massive growth they have going on in China. I say, you know, you guys have serious environmental problems, but you guys are just booming here. And it's staggering. It's phenomenal. Right. I say,
do you know what they're investing in agriculture in the next 5 years?
It's
50 billion yuan.
That's
50
right.
billion yuan. Divide by 8 for dollars,
yeah.
But that's a lot of money.
So I said, Yi, how are you guys going to sustain this? He says, well, here's the plan. He says, within 20 years or so, we're going to do exactly what you guys did, the Americans, in China. We're going to outsource everything down to Africa. All of our manufacturing is going to go down to Africa. Now, pretend that will in fact happen. What's that going to do for, or how's that going to impact agriculture? Is that going to provide a massive economic stimulus and then agriculture will fix itself? Or is that going to put more weight on the continent?
Good question. I don't know. I'll just give you my opinions. If there's not nutrition and health first, they won't have the ability to grow their economy because you won't have that first. Assuming that you have an underlying economy that builds on on agriculture, and you can create some degree of wealth, which leads to some degree of education. Remember, the Chinese started with some degree of education before we outsourced to them. That's not the case in many parts of Africa. The universities there are abysmal. Even the very best universities can't teach science. They have no chemicals. You can buy Clorox and salt from the grocery store, but that's about all they have in many places. So if you don't have that to start with, don't have education to start with, I don't know how you'll get the outsourcing. I think they've got to be, that's an interesting view because you know they're investing a lot now, the exploitation, development of gold and other precious metals by China out of African continent, the oil that's now that's part of Sudan's future, Darfur notwithstanding. These are issues that they are dealing with now and presumably in preparation for the outsourcing that's required. There's a real question about how China will survive in the one-child family, in the future of a one-child nation, where the workforce is going to decline dramatically as that takes hold. The numbers of men I think, 3 million more males than female babies in the last generation? Is it more than that? 1 to 8. it's already a challenge. So it may be what they're looking at. I think that'll be a stretch. I don't know if that's the issue. If Africa can do that, not Africa today. And if we can't meet Millennium Goals of having poverty, most of which will be in Africa, I think that's a pipe dream. That's an interesting. I don't know how they're going to get there, how they see it happening. There might be countries like Uganda, like Rwanda, that are more progressive now that will be recipient, and there may be some of those. But Angola and Zimbabwe, not with the current rulers.
So you mentioned that there needs to be a 40% increase in the next 3 years in the genetic potential of these different crops. And I guess the thing you mentioned, there's 8 different traits that are now stacked into one particular crop.
Right.
What do you see as the upper ceiling of that? I mean, how far can you go before epistatic effects are
No
just too
idea.
insane?
No idea. I don't think we'll know that until it gets done. And there are some genes that will not be accepted by the genome. I mean, that's what experiments are for and field trials are about. But right now, I haven't seen more than 8, and the 8 are crossed in. I've seen 4 and 5 and 6. We put 14 genes at a time in rice, and all were maintained. And we have not seen effects on growth. These were genes that had different capabilities in rice, but we don't know the limit. And at this point, it's a minor percentage of the total. Considering that when you make a maize hybrid, you can lose 10% of the DNA just by the cross. You knock out 10% here, and adding a minuscule percentage of a plus isn't seen as a significant challenge. I think we really won't know until time. And I think the opportunities for developing artificial chromosomes in which you can do more control introduction will be part of this technology development as well. That will allow more introduction of more controlled rate. I think the outcomes won't be known though for years. I mean, we won't do those things until we know where they're headed. And I think as long as there's good analytics, and you can really do the rigorous safety that can be attributed, that's really risk-based safety analysis. And I think when we finally get to that point, we'll know what should or shouldn't be done in terms of numbers of genes or types of genes. I haven't seen a limit so far. Do you remember a number of years ago, the International Rice Research Institute created what were called trisomic lines. They put in a whole chromosome. They would have 3 copies of chromosomes instead of 1 or just the 2. And they use that to map genes, but it's an enormous amount of DNA to put in. I mean, compared to what we'll get by genetic engineering, and the impacts were really very minimal. So I think there's a capacity there. One of my professors said years ago, capturing ATP or creating ATP with sunlight is limitless. There's so much can be done. It's not going to be energy that limits it. It's going to be other things that limit.
Are you familiar with Aaron DeGrassi's paper and his assessment of genetically modified crops in South Africa and his conclusion that biotechnology is an inappropriate method of agricultural innovation for poverty alleviation? And what is your response?
Can you tell me? No, I'm not. Can you tell me what the issues were that he was concerned with?
His concern that many of the field trials have failed, and also that the GMOs do not address issues such as declining commodity prices, inequality in land distribution and ownership, income disparities, and armed conflict.
It certainly would not affect them. The land ownership issues are big, as you know, and the nature of profits depends upon how that market develops. Remember, I talked about at the end of my talk about what does South Africa do with their extra corn. We do know that the cotton prices have stayed high, and those that have continued, that have planted GM crops have gone back. About 90% go back year after year, not because they have to, but because the profit margins are higher. So with that in mind, the part equidistribution of wealth is an issue that all countries struggle with. We have our own challenges here. But I'm not sure if you would attribute that 1.8 million, the 1.8 million farmers in South Africa that use GM cotton and soy, I don't know how that, cotton and maize, sorry, not soy, cotton and maize in South Africa. I'm not sure how that plays out on the local level. I don't have knowledge about the local economy. Sorry.
With regard to NERICA, the New Rice for Africa, and the work that Dr. Monty Jones did. The statement that NERICA had difficulty in being reproduced in farmers' fields and in order to be
in subsequent years.
In subsequent years,
not the first two, but in the third and fourth seasons, right?
Right. Fine on the technical side, but my concern is that by stating that in isolation of African states, African governments being under very strict conditions placed on them by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to privatize and to disengage from the state, required to cut subsidies for agriculture, among many other subsidies, casts the question in a way where we don't really see the whole picture. So that's one, that I think we really need to see the larger political economy situation in which African governments exist in order to make the decisions that they do ultimately to carry out policies and the very constrained situation that they have to do that. The second question is with regard to to intellectual property rights,
right.
Which you made reference to and appreciate that. I just would like to hear a little bit more about what I consider a great challenge for the considerable genetic resources that are on the African continent, in sorghum, in Oryza glaberrima, in the cassava and the yams, the dioscorias. There are many, many resources here of use to Africa and to the world. My question is about the role that Africans who are not fully engaged in the market, which is the majority of the farmers, who are not in a monetized system and don't have access to their legal systems within their countries to control those genetic resources and gain the benefit from it. It's a very complex issue, and I appreciate that, but I wonder if you could give us a little bit about your thoughts on that, how those farmers, if it is of value to you, for them to gain benefit from the genetic resources that they currently control.
Yeah, it's a good question. If you take it apart and talk about cassava and sweet potato, those are both Peruvian, and they came from Peru by the Portuguese to Africa. And so I think if you go backwards and say where's the genetic resource value, I think you probably go back to Peru and the Andes rather than to Africa.
But yeah, dioscorea.
Dioscorea, yeah, that's a local, as is as glaberrima. And as far as I know, and Monty Jones is the only one that I know of that's exploiting Warda, I think, is the one using most of that resource for West Africa. I haven't seen an intent. You're obviously aware of the issue with basmati rice. When Texas farmers tried to file an IP on basmati rice instead of the Indian subcontinent doing it. The potential for that to happen is always there. I know that the CG system recognizes that local ownership and values it. I think most of us work through the CG Center. So the CG centers all have intellectual property policies that relate to the use of local germplasm and then the reward of that back if there is discovery from it. What I don't know is if that is as widely shared in non-CG crops. That is, the crops that are not governed by the CGIAR or that doesn't have local involvement. So I don't know how to address it outside of CG centers because I'm not as familiar with those as you apparently are. So I know of the issues and the importance of them in each of those crops, but I don't know what the issues are, and I don't know what has happened in those crops where the dioscorea and others have been used. But it's an issue that has to be managed by local resources. I know when I was in Uganda, they said, "Can you help us with our botanical collection? How do we use it?" They had no knowledge of how to use that material. So I've asked Peter Raven if he would, and Peter Raven, who is at the Missouri Botanical Garden and has some of the best knowledge of biodiversity and conservation of anybody that I know of, especially in germplasm, management. We'll have a team there. They're very big and they're very strong in Madagascar, but don't have anything in around the lakes region, the Lake Victoria region. So it's country by country, and it's not going to be the same. Because in my opinion, there is probably as much value in the non-crop plants as there is in the crop plants. How do you manage that? If you look at Artemisia, for example, how do you manage Artemisia? Well, we have now a company in California that has recreated all of the pathways to make Artemisia in E. coli. So artemisinin will not be taken from the plants in Africa. They'll be created there. And according to the inventor, that's being shared back, but I don't know how.
I think we'll take one more question. This is actually Roger's second seminar today, and I think he deserves a break after this. So one more question, please.
Yeah, one of your first slides talked about the importance of markets. And the obvious market for much of Africa is Europe, for instance, bananas and stuff. But as long as Europe says we don't want genetically modified foods, it seems to me that there isn't very much promise for crop biotechnology in Africa. There's no place to export their products to.
That's certainly been the major holdup for Egypt and for northern Africa, where there is more out. I think most of what's sold out of Central and South Africa are things like flowers. I mean, you talk about exploitation of workers, that's it. I mean, it's a big flower industry where you don't grow food, you just grow flowers to send to Holland. I happen not to be in favor of that, but that's my own bias. So the amount of whether or not how genetics will be used, I think will be largely local. And when countries have started to consider what a total value of their ag commodities are in fact sent to Europe, it is an extremely small amount. So yes, there is the challenge that says in the future there might be a European market, so let's not engage. That's now being overruled by the ministries of the economic ministries. There is a shift going on in the Africa Union, and the presidents have said this is an issue of economics. We can't have an economy without agriculture first. We have to get over the barrier. They're now starting to put agriculture in the Department of Economics rather than in the Department of Environment, because environmental ministers were not managing it as an industry. You can argue with whether or not food ought to be commoditized, ought to be marketed or not. The point is, if you don't have a market, you don't develop an industry. And right now, they've made a change and said this is an issue that is an economic issue. So I think, as I've heard it out of South Africa, that the amount of product that actually goes to Europe is far smaller than the amount of American aid that goes into those countries. So the issue of whether or not that's real or it's a real concern or is a valid concern is being raised in the AU.
Well, thank you all for your lively questions, challenging, I think.
Challenge for sure. Thank you.